So hi, my name's Dave Richardson. I'm a chemistry professor here at Williams. I've been at Williams for 23 years and my specific subspecialty is organic chemistry. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about my experiences with respect to teaching introductory organic chemistry. Those courses are Chem 156 and 251. And the topic that I'm going to focus on is what I would call building bridges to students in large lecture courses. I think the techniques that I've developed over the years that I've been teaching these courses have proven very effective, and I think I've been very successful in implementing them. And I think the general things that I'll talk about briefly would be of use to people in any sort of large lecture format. Some of the things I'll say are certainly specific to science courses, but I think that they can be modified to help people teaching any large lecture course. So first of all, the challenges. Chemistry has a bad reputation in general, I think, sort of nationwide. I think there are lots of reasons for that I won't go into, but one of them is, of course, that I think generally chemistry tends to be poorly taught in high school, so students come into chemistry classes with a set of attitudes about what they're going to be like. Second, the courses are large. This is a two-semester sequence. The first course generally has about 125 students in it, the second about 100. In fact, I think these are some of the largest lecture courses on campus. Third, there is a significantly large number of pre-medical students in these courses. It's about 50%. There's nothing wrong with having pre-medical students in your courses. I find them, in fact, to be among the most motivated students that I've ever worked with. And parenthetically, I worked as the pre-medical advisor at Williams for 5 years, so I know these people very well. But they can come into a course with a number of sort of pre-formulated approaches to the course that I think are often negative and need to be worked against. So those would include the fact that they're attending the course because it's a requirement, which means that if they got to vote with their feet, they probably wouldn't be there. Second, many of them come into the course with a sort of make it or break it mentality that puts a lot of unnecessary pressure on them. For many of those students, they feel wrongly that only an A will do. And finally, there's a huge amount of inaccurate, stereotypical information about what a course in organic chemistry is going to be like. And so you have to work against those particular challenges, on top of the fact that you have a lot of students. That's a pretty challenging group of things to meet. So the techniques that I use for addressing all of these challenges I think will work in any large course. So the first is that I think as an instructor you just have to commit to the fact that this is going to be extra work, that this is going to be an unusual class, and that it's going to require an additional level of commitment and effort. And you have to simply accept that and hope that you have good colleagues with whom you can trade that work off occasionally. I think you need to send a very clear message from the beginning, so now I'm talking about bridge building, that you want to get to know your students. For example, I think it's critical that you learn the name of every student in your class, even if you have 125 of them, and that you do that early on. I do it by the end of the second week. You should make yourself a Facebook, if that's helpful, to get to know the names of your students. You should use those names in class. It's remarkable but true that students almost always sit in exactly the same places, so that makes it easier to learn their names. And in the unusual ones who move around are actually easier to learn the names of because they're unusual. I think you need to take every opportunity to invite students to come to your office. So for example, when I know I'm going to be teaching one of these large courses, I send every student a personal letter before the beginning of the semester, and I introduce myself and I encourage, in fact I require, that every student visit my office in the first week of classes to say hello and to introduce themselves personally. So I think that sort of outreach sends a very clear message that you really do want to get to know them as people. As I said a moment ago, I think it's also critical that you use the names of the students, not just learn them. So in class, call on people by name and warn them in advance that part of your pedagogical strategy will be, although it puts them on the spot, everybody should be comfortable with the fact that you're going to be calling on them by name. That reinforces the use of names in the class overall. I always try to make it very clear to students, in addition, that they should understand that although there are 125 people sitting in my classroom, that I can see every one of them, and that I pay attention to whether they're looking at me, whether they're daydreaming, whether they're looking at their notes or talking to each other. I think most students think that in a large anonymous group that there's no way that a faculty member can actually be aware of what they're doing. Nothing could be falser. So make it clear that you do see them. I want to stress, I think you should pose direct questions to your class, give them the opportunity to answer, and to pose those questions to individuals using their names. The flip side of that is you have to offer praise. You have to say, Jeff, that was a great question. Now let me explain why. Repeat the answer that Jeff provides. And even if the answer isn't such a great one, pull out the bits that are and provide praise for those pieces of forward progress. I always encourage my students to understand that there's essentially a big, invisible, but bright red handle in front of each and every one of them that they can pull if they need to stop the class and ask a question. And everybody should be comfortable pulling on that handle. And in fact, I inject opportunities to pause in my classes where I basically step away from the board and I say, okay, somebody must have a question. Somebody ask me a question. I will not proceed until somebody asks me a question. And that takes a while to get into the spirit of, but eventually it does work very, very well. And in addition, I would try to be creative about finding ways to build into your lectures ways that you can get students to speak up. So this can vary from the highly professional to the extremely corny. I tend to gravitate towards the corny end, but for example, on Fridays, my class meets 3 times a week in the morning typically. On Friday mornings, for the first 5 minutes of class after announcements, I ask students if they'd like to tell a joke. And it's actually a very challenging thing for an individual to stand up in front of 125 peers and tell a joke. But eventually students warm up to the whole thing, and I can tell that I'm making progress getting to know them by just how raunchy the jokes get towards the end of the semester. Next item in terms of building bridges is to be available. So when I teach one of these classes, I'm committed to offering lots of office hours, typically 20-minute slots. I have a sign-up system. I encourage students to coordinate attendance. But I will plan for 10 hours of office hours when I'm teaching one of these big classes, and I will add to that number of slots just before some significant event, like an exam. I think you just have to be committed to that. If students know that you're committed to it, they'll show up and they'll ask questions. This may be different in classes that aren't science-based, but particularly in classes that involve lots of problem solving, which is the activity that we're trying to promote in a course like organic chemistry, it's essential. As I said, I encourage students to come together, maybe 3 or 4 students maximum to an office hour slot, and I tell them that if for some reason they can't make my scheduled slots, they should email me and we'll work out an alternative time. And you really have to stick to that and to commit to it. And in addition, you have to be willing to offer extra slots around exams, as I said a moment ago. In addition, in a course like organic chemistry, I offer 2 weekly problem-solving sessions of about an hour each. I assign problems that I make up, and I will go through those problems during those sessions. I think that element of sort of distance away from the classroom where you're working together as teammates to solve a problem and to learn the techniques of solving problems, I think is really, really essential. I offer one in the evening and then one in the afternoon, sometimes during the week. Third, I think it's really important to be visible, to be present to students in as many ways as you possibly can. So for example, in organic chemistry, we also have an associated lab program, typically as many as 8 lab sections with about 16 students per lab section. I'll teach one of those as the head instructor, but I make a point, particularly early in the semester, of visiting every one of those lab sections in the beginning of the afternoon's work, just to say hello, to reinforce my name learning with students, to ask questions about how the course is going, just to be present and visible as the person who's not only in charge of the course, but really interested in all aspects of what the students are experiencing. So I think that's critical. Next, I think just in terms of structuring a course that's going to be offered to so many students simultaneously, that you need to offer several opportunities for students to perform so that they can demonstrate improvement over the course of the semester. So for example, in the first semester of organic, a couple of weeks into the semester, we have a quiz. I call it a tune-up. It's really an exercise that's going to approximate an exam, but that will have a very small point impact so that people can get a sense that, okay, I know how to take an exam in this class. This one I made some mistakes on it. They didn't cost me much. Now I know, in addition, I have 2 more midterm exams that I can demonstrate my improvement on. So you can't just have one midterm. The stakes are simply too high. So offering several opportunities to be tested and to perform and show improvement, I think, is very, very important. My classes also include a cumulative final. Next, I think it's essential that you offer as much feedback to individuals as possible. So, for example, in a course like Introductory Organic, I grade all of the exams, all of the quizzes, and I make a point of writing comments in my own handwriting on the exams to students, telling them the things that I think they need to do better. And in addition, if I think they've done something really well, I give positive feedback in that setting. One of the most important techniques that I've learned that I think is unusual in the way that I teach classes, at least at Williams, is that at the end of every exam, I write some words that give the students a sort of global sense of how they did, in my opinion, on the exam overall. And in particular, if students underperformed, they get a handwritten invitation from me on that exam that says, I expect you to come and talk to me. And we're going to sit down and go through this exam and try to understand why it didn't go well. I can't tell you the number of students over the 20 or so years that I've been teaching here that have really responded positively to that technique. Many of them telling me, I've never had a professor who's written a comment to me before that says, you need to come and see me, and I expect you to do it. It takes a lot of work, but I think it's really not only essential, I think it's really productive and effective. And I think it's also important to make a point of recognizing student performance outside the classroom. So if you run into one of your students in the hall, try to think fast on your feet and say, Jay, you did a great job on that exam, or Michelle, that was a fabulous exam overall, but that one problem I think you could have done better on. Let's talk about that. So I think both praise, encouragement, sort of a realistic assessment to students when you run into them, or maybe even make a point of pulling them aside after class and saying, you know, maybe we could talk about that exam. I think all of that, although a bit scary, is essential for students in a large course to know that that represents that you see them as individuals and that you're willing to help them and work with them any way that you can. And then finally, just 3 last things that I constantly try to think about when I'm teaching a large course, and that is try to be calm, and yet at the same time, second thing, be energetic. I think students will forgive you an enormous number of sins in a classroom if you demonstrate that you've got a lot of energy for what you're doing. And finally, I think it's essential in everything that you do to show that you like what you're doing, that you're taking on teaching this large class because you really want to do it, that there's something positive that comes out of the experience. And I think you have to constantly communicate that just because the course is big, that doesn't mean that it can't proceed as if it's really just a conversation between 2 people, you and the student. If you work at all the things that I've suggested, I really think, and I know from many years of experience, that that's what can happen. So I hope that's been helpful. Thank you.